Welcome to the Bilingual Montessori webinar series. Hello, I'm Amy with Bilingual Montessori. We are here to support you in building stronger bilingual programs. This series has been made possible through Erasmus Plus funding by the European Union. The language of languages. It's a whole other language. In this webinar, Dr. Aoife Ahern, a professor of languages education at the Universidad Complutense of Madrid, and bilingual education expert and teacher educator Lucie Urbančíková from the Czech Republic, show us the basics about languages. Knowing the terminology for language acquisition and understanding the process that happens in bilingual education will give you more confidence to share with others the wonderful experiences that you observe happening in your classrooms. Aoife shares her depth of knowledge and interesting facts about language. Lucie joins at the end to reflect on the content and provide you with some ways to help you use what you've learned from Aoife. Knowing the terms is one thing, but sharing the knowledge in the community helps to integrate it. We hope you enjoy this webinar and find it useful to reflect on.
I'm very excited to talk to you in this webinar because I'm going to discuss a topic that's exciting for me, that's fun for me. It's terminology related to languages and language learning. I think this terminology will be helpful for you if you work with children in second language learning or with multilingual or bilingual children. And therefore, I'm going to show you a presentation. So our webinar today is called Do We Speak the Same Language About Languages? And the content has been developed by myself and Lucie Urbančíková, who will be talking towards the end of the webinar, bringing up some interesting questions. The topic is important, as I said before, especially when we're working as educators with children who may know one language, speak a different language at home and a language at school, or more than one language at school. We need to be able to discuss everything related to languages because they're fundamental to the child's development and learning processes. So we're going to cover several different topics, and we'll be discussing words related to these topics throughout this webinar. So all the words we want to really focus on are terminology connected to language and languages. Firstly, obviously, the child is the center of our attention. The child is the focus of the educational process, and we want to create ways to work in a child-centered approach in Montessori schools. So we're going to place emphasis on children's language development and what sort of concepts are important when we think about children's language development, and also languages which are something independent from the child but related to the child, so languages in relation to the child. Also the processes of developing the first language and other languages in a child, and language ecologies, because children are situated in societies and communities where one or more than one languages are essential for their growth and learning. So some of the words that we're going to discuss are really the basics that everybody should be able to handle in a conversation, whether it's an expert, a parent, a family member, even a child. And others will be words that are probably very important and interesting, especially for teachers. So you can see how we've divided this slide into two sections. So as teachers, it's interesting to have some concepts and names for them to refer to the child's developmental process in their language acquisition and learning, and also to refer to how children are living in, immersed in a language or several languages, and how that impacts upon their educational processes. So in terms of the child, well, we can say that a child, we can describe a child as a bilingual or multilingual child. We can also consider how the child has come to have or to be able to communicate with these languages. So children may be what we would label simultaneous or sequential bilinguals if they have more than one language, or children may be monolingual at certain points. So a bilingual or multilingual person is any person who speaks two languages. Obviously with the prefix bi, we mean two languages, or multiple languages, more than two. It's interesting to consider, I think, that it's known that probably about 3/4 of the world's population is bilingual at least. And it's not really, we don't have clear statistics or numbers, but studies have been done, and they've deduced that, you know, the majority of people in the world are at least bilingual. They speak some of a language in addition to the language they have been acquiring since birth, or they have acquired more than one language since birth. So referring to the issue of starting from birth is this concept of simultaneous bilingualism as opposed to sequential bilingualism. And this is about the process that the child grows through. A child who's a simultaneous bilingual has acquired more than one language from birth, or two languages if we use the word bilingual, or very early in life. So maybe in a Montessori setting where a child has attended school since very, very early, they may become bilingual, simultaneous bilinguals, thanks to the school setting. If they're being immersed in a second language at school, that's different from their home language. And then there are sequential bilinguals, who are children or people who become proficient in an additional language besides the one or the ones that they acquired from very early in life. So once they've established competence in their mother tongue, they acquire a new language. So we call them sequential, because it's a sequence of becoming bilingual or multilingual. And then a monolingual is a person who speaks one language, mono as in one. Then we have this opposition between the native speaker and the non-native speaker. A native speaker is considered a person who begins acquiring a language from birth, this specific language. So in my case, I'm a native speaker of English, and other people acquire more than one language. For example, my children, I live in Spain, and I spoke to them in English from birth, and they heard everybody else speaking Spanish, except for their father sometimes, who would speak some English to them. So they were native speakers of two languages, Spanish and English. Fluency then is something else that we use when we talk about children's acquisition process. When a child is fluent in a language, or a person in general, we mean that when we say someone is fluent, we mean that they are capable of using what they know of that language appropriately and without much hesitation. So it's interesting to consider that to be fluent doesn't mean that you know all of the language, or that you know the language better than other people. It's a kind of ability to use what you know, to be able to express things without a lot of hesitation, or without feeling anxious, so it slows you down, or with, you know, being able to respond promptly when you hear something, whether it's a verbal response or a physical response, showing that you are using the language without, you know, being bogged down by hesitation or fear or worry or anything else, or lack of words. So even a person with very few words in a foreign language, we can say that they use those few words fluently, and we can say, well, they're fluent at A1 level. That means they only know a little bit of the language, but they are able to come up with a little bit that they know appropriately when needed. Another area I mentioned that we'll be dealing with is language development. So really, really important is the distinction between acquisition and learning. It's really important for everybody involved with children to understand this distinction. So acquisition of a language, or language acquisition, refers to processes in which the individual develops in a spontaneous way knowledge of a language and eventually the capability to use the language. In what Maria Montessori describes as the absorbent mind, a phase of life, a child is absorbing in an unconscious way lots of information about the language that they're acquiring, and this is an example of acquisition. It's also termed often as implicit learning. In acquisition, we develop implicit learning. That means that we don't think about what we're learning, but it's being absorbed into our minds because we're exposed, we're receiving this language in our environment. We're detecting it, we're noticing it, and we're engaging in it. Learning, as opposed to acquisition, is a way of developing knowledge and the ability to use language through effortful study, memorizing, practicing, and correcting or being corrected. So when somebody's learning, they realize that they are developing this new language, knowledge. It's not unconscious, it's conscious. They are trying to develop and they're trying to improve, and they're devising steps. They're thinking about how to get better at the use of this language. So that's the way it's opposed to acquisition, in the sense that it is conscious, it is effortful, and it involves more time and more concentration and mental effort in a certain way, conscious mental effort. Another important distinction in the process of child language acquisition, or the process of becoming or acquiring a second language or learning a second language, is a distinction established by Jim Cummins as a professor of English and multilingual education in Canada. And this distinction is known as BICS, which refers to social language, and the acronym BICS, BICS, means basic interpersonal communication skills, as opposed to academic language, which Cummins calls CALP, and this acronym means cognitive academic language proficiency. BICS, basic interpersonal communication skills, consist of the ability to use language for ordinary everyday situations outside of school, when we need to function in life in general, but not necessarily, obviously, for academic purposes. So a child who plays using a language, or does exploring media, stories, film, other resources where this language is present, or goes to a shop and uses this language, is developing their social language, their basic interpersonal communication skills, where they learn to greet people, they learn to ask for something that they need in a shop or in the park or in some other context besides the room. Whereas in the area of CALP, cognitive academic language proficiency, the child develops language that they're going to use when they write, language that they will be experiencing or being exposed to through reading content and texts about different topics non-fiction texts usually that will be giving them information about science, biology, music, whatever other subject they're learning. So it's this integrated curriculum that's present in the Montessori schools, where a child develops knowledge of language so they understand new concepts. So they learn, they enrich their vocabulary with the help of a guide or teacher, and then they become skilled through practice in using these new specific terms that are known or classified sometimes as academic terminology or academic vocabulary. They've been academic words, let's say. They can be described in lots of different ways, but it could be useful for teachers to know that in setting goals with children and accompanying them on their language development processes, child needs to be able to use language for social interaction, but also for learning more specific content from different subjects. As for the process of learning, we can think about something I mentioned briefly before, implicit versus explicit learning, or it can also be thought of as passive versus active learning. Implicit learning is similar to acquisition. The distinction is maybe connected to what we're focusing on when we're talking about the development of language. We can talk about implicit vocabulary learning or implicit grammar learning. And there are many, many academic studies and scientific studies that show how grammar learning, for example, is much more effective when it's learned or acquired implicitly. The human mind is more attuned to holding on to information about how to use the grammar of a language when it is accumulated, this information, in an implicit way, then when we think about the language and think about a rule and try to apply it. In fact, although this is a necessary part of language learning, talking about rules and thinking about them and trying to apply them is less efficient than implicit learning of those rules. However, we often don't have the choice. Sometimes implicit learning is slow, and so explicit learning can help to boost it a bit. And sometimes people need some explicit learning to impulse, to push forward their implicit learning, especially when it refers to a language that's not in their community outside of school, and they may have limited input in this language. So explicit learning is like the same as learning, as I mentioned before, in opposition to acquisition. The child or the learner studies, tries to remember, practices, and tries to improve with this purpose in mind. The native language as opposed to the mother tongue is another important distinction in connection to languages in relation to the child. So as I mentioned before, the native language is a language that the child is acquiring from very early on in life. And this is different from the mother tongue, which is the language that the child's mother speaks. And normally our mother tongue is the first language that we are exposed to, even inside of the uterus, and a fetus begins to detect the sounds from their mother's language and differentiate those sounds from other sounds that they can hear once their hearing has developed in the fetus. And this has been taken as evidence of certain aspects, at least, of language that are native, that are hardwired into the human brain, and they're universally shared by every human being, because every child is born with this language faculty, with this basis that has developed even before birth. Native language, then, it can be different from the mother tongue, because perhaps a child is spoken to in a different language besides the mother's language, or the mother speaks to the child in more than one language. And so if the child is exposed to this language regularly from birth, from very early on in life, this language will also be their native language. So a child may have a mother tongue, which is the same as their native language, or they may have several native languages in addition to the mother tongue. That's probably not the usual situation, but it can happen. Sorry. Now we can see on this table 4 different categories. We can see second language as opposed to foreign language, and also additional language as opposed to dominant language. Well, they all kind of are separated from one another. Second, foreign, and additional language can all mean the same thing, really. They refer to languages that the child learns after they have their first languages established. So if we speak one language as our native language, then we learn an additional language. This language, because it's sequentially the second language that we learn, that we acquire, is we can refer to it as the second language. If we learn another language after the second language, we can call that the additional language. When we refer to a language that is not spoken in the community where we live, we can refer to that as the foreign language. So in the case of the English language, in many let's say in continental Europe, so anywhere on the European continent, English is a foreign language. But at the same time, this situation is starting to be thought of in a different way. Why? Because of the fact that English has become very global, and the fact that there are many different varieties of English that are being used by non-native speakers all around the world, and also because of the fact that children may be exposed to English through media, online apps, through consuming media like films, cartoons, any other kinds of games that they play in English, they might feel that it's not really foreign anymore because it's been around from the beginning for this child or these children. So yes, it's a foreign language, but at the same time, it could be thought of as an additional language or a second language. It's in our environments, even if we don't live in an English-speaking or a country where English is an official language. An additional language, it can refer to even the second language if we don't want to specify. So, you know, in any particular school, in any classroom, it's very likely that there will be children who speak a language at home which is different from the school language and may not be English either. We will still often think of English, well, because maybe in Madrid, English is a second language for a lot of people and a foreign language. We might call it the second language, but really for a subset of our students, it's an additional language. It's not just a second language because they already come to school with Spanish and another language from home. So calling it an additional language is a way to generalize and kind of include everybody who's in our group, in our classroom, let's say. Whereas calling it a second language could be considered a way of saying, well, you know, this is the language for children who are monolingual speakers of our community language. And in this sense, it's kind of becoming more politically correct or maybe open to say, well, it's an additional language. Still, it's classically called a second language in educational context. ESL, English is a second language, or EFL, English is a foreign language. They're popular acronyms that people have often heard of, probably. Foreign, again, it's the language that's from a country that's not the official language of the community. And then dominant language can be the language that is predominant in the community or in this particular person. So the language that we are more comfortable with is our dominant language. The language that is more widely spoken in a community is the dominant language for that community, and likewise with the school. Okay, so here we can just revise the things that I mentioned before. Second language, the first foreign language or language learned after the mother tongue. Additional language, any language learned after the mother tongue or mother tongues. So there we see how a bilingual person can be feel more included when we use additional languages. Foreign language, the official language of a different country. Dominant language, the language the speaker is most comfortable in. So thanks so much for listening this far. We're going to end this part of the webinar, and there will be a second section of the same webinar coming up. So just, we've talked about the basics, the terminology in relation to the child as a learner of languages, as an acquirer of languages, and also to the languages around the child in society and the child's relationship to these languages. So thanks for listening. See you shortly in the second webinar.